I'm going to talk you through a Part A question on Crossan. So remember, Crossan comes in Theme 1 in the A2 content. He's Theme 1F. And so if you're cross-referencing with your textbook, that's in the second textbook. I'm starting with the specification because actually there is quite a lot to know about Crossan. It isn't just why does Crossan think Jesus is a social revolutionary. There are very, very specific things that you need to know. So first of all, Crossan is contrasted with N.T. Wright. And so it says here, a comparison of work of two key scholars, including their views of Jesus, with reference to different methods of studying Jesus, John Dominic Crossan and N.T. Wright. So there could be a compare question in Part A. That could be quite challenging, but you need to be prepared for that. Then if we look at the Crossan section on his own, again, there's quite a lot there. So Jesus, the social revolutionary, using apocryphal gospels, seeing Jesus as a product of his time, and what would the words of Jesus have meant in Jesus' time. And this could be played out in about 3 questions, and so you need to be prepared for those. Particularly if you're sitting this exam June 2019, because Crossan is an untested bit of the spec. And so he's a real focus for your revision. So you could have a question that says something like, this is all Part A, explain why Crossan thinks that Jesus is a social revolutionary, or explain the case for Jesus being a social revolutionary. They might not even name Crossan in the question. It could be explain why Crossan thinks that it's valid to use apocryphal gospels to understand who Jesus was. I think that's less likely for Part A because that's the Part B content. It could be explain the importance of seeing Jesus as a product of his time, or explain what the words of Jesus may have meant in his time. And again, they might not name check Crossan in the question. And that's why you need to know the specification, because you need to write about the scholar that they are expecting. The Part 2 question is the validity of using apocryphal gospels to understand Jesus. And so the statement would say something like, using the apocryphal gospels to understand Jesus is valid. Evaluate this view. I think that is quite challenging. And remember, that would be the 30 marker. And so when you're choosing your question, you're going to be mostly swayed by the Part B. And so if you find the Part B hard, you might not choose the question, even though some of these Crossan Part A's would be relatively straightforward to write and also interesting to write, which, you know, gets you through an exam. However, note that it says here, issues for analysis and evaluation can be drawn from any aspect of the content above. And so in theory, I haven't seen them do it yet with Christianity, they could have a Part B that says Jesus was a social revolutionary, discuss. But I think this is much more likely. So let's look at the question that I have chosen. I have deliberately chosen quite a broad question so that I can take you through most of the subject knowledge associated with Crossan. You need to be prepared for the fact that it might be a much more specific question, and so you would need to write in more detail. So my question reads, and I've had to make this up because there are no past questions for Crossan. Explain how Crossan uses a wide range of evidence from the 1st century to argue that Jesus was a social revolutionary. And so there are 2 horns to this question. Wide range of evidence. So what is the methodology basically of Crossan? And how does that make how does Crossan end up claiming that Jesus was a social revolutionary? And so as I talk you through my answer, I'm going to highlight to you where I have used religious language or Crossan's terms or vocabulary. And remember, that's one of the things they're looking for to put you in a top band. Where my sources of wisdom are, mainly Bible passages. Where my scholars are. Now, Crossan's going to appear all the way through this answer. There would be a problem if he didn't. But I'm also going to refer to, for example, historians like Josephus. In addition, I'm going to refer to schools of thought such as source criticism. And then, in yellow, I'm going to highlight and show you where I have linked back to the question. Because for this kind of question, it's important that you refer to both halves of the question. So you deal with both what's the methodology, what's the evidence that Crossan uses and why, and how does that lead to him being a social revolutionary. So perhaps controversially, I have started with an introduction. Introductions rarely gain you marks, but I'm using them as a settling tool to make sure that I address the question and perhaps to sort of plot out what my answer is going to look like so I can keep referring back to it. So if you see, I have got the two strands of the answer are in my introduction, so wide range of evidence and social revolutionary. I've also got some key terms in there. So for example, the canonical Gospels. So they're the Gospels, remember, that made it into the Bible. And I'm also highlighting that I know the sort of evidence that Crossan is going to use. So he's going to use religious texts, which are not limited to the canonical Gospels, historical documents, and anthropological studies. So this is my first paragraph. And I talk about the name of Crossan's book, The Historical Jesus, and then his approach of gathering evidence. So again, linking back to the question, because the first part of the question was all about, what kind of evidence is Crossan using to create an unbiased picture of who Jesus was. I am then using deliberately key terms that Crossan uses. So in his book, he talks about a triple triadic process. That sounds much more complicated than it actually is. It's just 3 ways, if you like, of uncovering who Jesus is. And then those 3 ways all have different layers. And so the first triad, so I'm using Crossan's language again, involves sociological and anthropological studies of the time. I'm using that phrase artisan. Remember that Crossan called Jesus an artisan because he was a carpenter. And so Crossan starts by looking at sociological studies of what life was like in 1st century Palestine. And that helps him understand Jesus because that's where Jesus was living. Then he looks at historical writings of the time, and one of his major sources is Josephus. I have named Josephus there. And then I have used a nice little phrase that you came across when we were looking at redaction criticism, which is sitzum leben. And I've chosen that phrase deliberately. And that's the idea that to understand the stories, you need to look at the setting of life of Jesus or of the gospel writers. I then go on to the next strand of Crossan's evidence. So we've looked at the sociological studies. We've looked at the historical writings from people such as Josephus. And now we're going to go on to Crossan's final layer of evidence, which are the religious texts. Okay, and so this is where I start to bring in my sources of wisdom. And so Crossan, remember, doesn't limit himself just to the Gospels that are in the Bible. In fact, he rejects much of what the Gospels say, but he does include, controversially, the Gospels of Thomas and Peter, which form part of the apocryphal Gospels, the texts found out at Nag Hammadi. And then, so that I have got the detail in there, I'm talking about how he decides which religious texts to use. And the first decision is all about how early the text is. And Crossan says he wants texts that are from between 30 and 70 CE. And I've got some good subject knowledge in here. I've got the dating of Thomas, which is 50 CE. And he also dates the Gospel of Peter as also being prior to Matthew and Luke. I've then got my next source of wisdom, and so remember that Crossan uses the Q document because he says that predates Matthew and Luke. And so I've also got in there my other school of thought, which is source criticism. So remember that I'm aware that my essay is perhaps a little scholar light, and so I'm deliberately putting in schools of thought. And remember that source criticism says that there was this document that was used by the author of Matthew and Luke, and they both draw from that document and put stories in their Gospels. And if both Matthew and Luke draw on that document, it had to exist before Matthew and Luke were written. And so that is Crossan's method. So historical documents, anthropological and early religious texts. He also looks for stories that appear in multiple sources. That makes them more reliable. And so then I talk about the picture of Jesus that Crossan creates. So I'm now dealing with the second part of the question. So painting a picture of Jesus as a social revolutionary. And again, I'm going to use key phrases that Crossan uses. And so he talks about Jesus having open table fellowship. That basically just means inviting everyone to eat with him, not being exclusive. And then as my source of wisdom, I refer to the fact that there are many parables or stories, even in those early documents, those earlier Gospels, of open feasts. And then I talk about the story of the Good Samaritan to highlight how Jesus is clashing with the values of the time. So in the story of the Good Samaritan, of course, the Levite and the priest walk past the Samaritan, and they do that because they don't want to make themselves ritually impure. And so people at the time would have been very, very suspicious of anybody who, ate with people that others would have considered to be impure. So women, sinners, tax collectors, Samaritans, and so on. And then again, I'm using the language here of Crossan. So he talks about Jesus's revolutionary egalitarianism. So seeing people as equal, which is the opposite of sort of the Jewish temple elites and Roman imperialism. So Jesus is, rebelling against the Romans and the Jews. He then, Crossan, rejects the idea of miracles, and he calls them social healings. And so he says it isn't that Jesus, removed people's illnesses, he just removed them as a barrier to being accepted in society. He then talks about Jesus rejecting a settled, comfortable life, living on the edge of society, moving from town to town. And then finally, he rejects the idea that Jesus is claiming to be the Son of God as Christians understand it, but rather he's making a political claim, because Son of God was a title that was given to important people at the time.